Hi, Ian. It's great to connect today. I heard you speak at a conference we attended in Copenhagen, and I was impressed with your approach to leadership. So I reached out about doing the podcast interview, and I'm grateful for the chance we had to talk today.
It's my pleasure, and I really appreciate you thinking of me and including me in this project.
So, what lesson have you learned about leadership and managing people that you would most like to pass on to others?
Well, if I go back to the conversation we were having in Copenhagen, one of the things that I think I stressed was if I'm in a role like this, where I'm more of a steward than a leader, and maybe that might be the lesson to understand when is leadership stewardship. So there's a task that I was entrusted with, like leading this business school, that I'm not the first person that's had this task. I didn't actually come up with the idea for the business school. I just was, it's my turn, right? So I'm the 12th person to have this role. There were 11 people before me, and my job is to think about the one after me. And so the lesson I've kind of been really evolving in my leadership is I think earlier in my career was around as a leader, can I come up with an idea about something I want to do? And then it became, can I come up with an idea that I can convince other people to do with me? And then can I measure that and do well with it and celebrate that? And now I think I'm at a stage for my leadership journey, which is a stewardship phase, which is can I think about running initiatives from the lens of being a forever initiative? So my starting principle with this business school is this place will be here forever, that there will never be a time when Orange County won't need the University of California, Irvine to be an institution of influence. They will always benefit this county more than it hurts this county. And so any decision I should be making should be with that lens. And that's much bigger than what would I like to do? What can I convince some people to do because it's convenient for them? What might be good for us as of today? That's sort of the evolution I've kind of gone. And, I would hope that everyone at some point in time in their leadership journey has the opportunity to take on a forever task. It's actually quite fulfilling. It's really rewarding, and you don't get the immediate return of the task, but you also know that you're contributing in a very different way. So that's kind of been my journey as a leader. I don't think I would have been saying that story 20 years ago, but it's certainly where I evolved as a person and certainly from a leadership perspective.
I think that's such an interesting perspective that I had not heard until I heard you give that talk at the conference, and hearing a little more detail around it is also interesting. And I don't know if followership, leadership, stewardship are all on the same dimension, like on a spectrum with followership on one end, leadership on the other, and stewardship or management somewhere in the middle. But I think this is a really interesting idea that it's not so much about you and your bold ideas of how you're going to completely change the organization to match you and your personality. It's more of this stewardship idea of how can I make this place stronger for the person coming after me. And maybe that's kind of a key distinction is so often maybe the stereotype of the leader is the trailblazer who feels like they're going to be there forever, but you're already thinking about the next
Yeah.
person. So I think there's a really
I
interesting
clearly was
perspective.
not because there were people before me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll tell you two stories that I think crystallized this for me. So I had the pleasure of living in Australia and New Zealand for about 15 years. And I did a lot of work with indigenous communities when I was there. And I'll give a specific example from my experience living in New Zealand when I was working with the Maori community there. I worked with one of the most successful companies in New Zealand. It's a indigenous held, Maori held organization, and they are community held. So they have their ownership is communal. And I was asked to do some consulting work with them, and I asked to read the strategic plan before I actually did the work so I could have context. And they had a 50-year strategic plan. I'd never seen a 50-year strategic
Mm.
plan before. And in the course of my conversations with them when I was providing them advice, someone said to me, that's really interesting. So explain to me how that would impact my great grandchildren.
Wow.
I never had a person, this is a commercial entity.
Wow.
They were in a whole bunch of very commercial spaces. This was not a not for profit. It was none of those things. So I had never heard a CEO of a company ask me how the decisions we were making today was going to impact their great grandchildren.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, just one second. Let me turn this off. That completely shocked me. And so I thought about that, and I thought, wow, I don't even know how to answer that question. And it was clear I needed to answer that question. I'll fast forward. I took this role here in Southern California, and I went to a pitch session shortly after arriving, where there was a company that was pitching for investment to create this company. And in the pitch, they were asking for money. They were talking about a product that they hadn't really developed yet. They didn't quite understand who the client was going to be. They had projections about all the money they were going to make. And in the projections, it stated that their goal was to have sold the business within 2 years so that the investors can get their money back. And I thought to myself, that's a completely different perspective on leadership.
Yeah.
So I had to kind of think, where am I positioning myself in this particular role?
One of my favorite quotes, ideas, is that all self-help boils down to think long term. And I like that perspective. I've never thought of that perspective being applied to leadership. The stewardship, Maori people, their strategic plan, if it wasn't explicitly stated, part of their strategic plan was obviously think long term.
Inherently multi-generational, inherently.
Yeah.
And we I think have examples of that in other cultures as well, but it is not the model of leadership that is promoted the most, certainly in most business school education, right? We have a model which is 3 to 5 years, quick returns. Long term is maybe 10 years. It's never multi-generational.
Yeah.
We don't focus, and as a result, the business models that we've developed are not forever problems, right? We don't, companies don't develop business models around being forever relevant. And so it just is a slightly different orientation towards how you would run, lead, and focus an organization. And it requires a different orientation too. I presented that logic for what I thought my role was in my very first town hall when I started here, right? So most of the people here had no idea who I was. And my last slide was, everything I'm doing for number 13. The number 13 is actually more important than you. And, it takes a certain relationship between you and the followers, or the people that you're entrusted to lead, to have them appreciate, because, most cases, no, the person I don't know in the future, they're definitely not important
Yeah.
and more important than me.
Yeah.
But it also is about instilling a sense of mission for the organization to say, hey, what we're doing is really important. We don't ever want to deprive this community of not having this. That's how important we think it is. And that changes the tone of how you lead.
So can you think of a specific example of a time where, had you thought more short term, more kind of typical leadership, where you would have made one decision, but because you were thinking about number 13, you made a different decision?
Well, I mean, there's many. So, one of the things that we make investments in is research. We hire scholars. We provide them with funding. There's certainly, things that we can do today that make that less expensive. We could hire or not hire a person. But what's the overall legacy of the program? I mean, a doctoral program inherently is one that's built on some notion of multi-generational impact. You're not making any money in a doctoral program. Like, that's never going to be a financial mechanism for us. But, a doctoral student that goes on and has a career over the next 30 years could shape the way thousands, hundreds of thousands of individuals think about what they're doing. And, that's the type of impact we would want to have as an institution. And I will never get credit for that. They will, but, the institution will be affiliated with that individual and will shape that thinking. So, those are the types of mission-driven activities that we want to focus on, that we have a rationale for why we do it. It doesn't just boil down to what's going to be the 3-year return on investment or return on asset.
Okay. Yeah, great example. So I was thinking about, or I interviewed a professor at, let me back up. I was talking to a professor at BYU, and BYU, it's actually where I did my undergrad, they have very strict requirements around who they can hire. And they were
Mm,
concerned 25 years ago that there weren't going to be enough people who would fit the criteria that they were looking for. And so they decided 25 years ago, well, we're just going to have to produce those people. And so
mm,
they invested a lot of time and resources 25 years ago into producing PhD students, not PhD students for their PhD program. They don't have a PhD program in management, but they created basically what turned into a pre-PhD almost degree, where if you get your MBA, you can get your MBA, but it's basically 2 years of prepping to do a PhD. And then they started moving it down to undergrad, to the seniors and juniors, and then the sophomores, and then the freshmen. And BYU, they made this investment into the long term. We're going to produce the scholars who will eventually come back to BYU and work at BYU. They conducted a study of all management business PhDs from 2009 to 2019, and they found that BYU had produced 290 management PhDs during that 10-year window, more than twice as many as the closest next school. So
mm.
Wharton was the next school, and they had produced something like 92. If you're in it for the short run, if you're in it for the 3 to 5 year window,
You're
that's
never
a
doing it.
totally different approach. And
Yeah,
and
you're
now
never
they're just,
doing it.
yeah. And
Yeah, I just think that in this is so it's not a value judgment, right? So I don't think every organization needs to have the same mission, right? So I actually don't think that the startup company that wants to get some capital, create a product, sell it to a larger firm, and exit with a 5x, 7x, 8x return in 3 years, that's I'm not saying that's bad.
yeah.
But what I'm saying is that's just one form of organization. And we should understand that their society needs multiple forms.
Hmm.
And as a result, you need leaders who take on different challenges. And in fact, even an individual can evolve, I don't even say evolve, can change in the course of their leadership journey around the type of mission that they focus on. And, I've had the luxury of thinking about something I wanted to do and getting some resources and doing it and feeling the reward associated with that, and maybe getting some other people to get. I've had that, but that's a slightly different story than I had my run at that. It did it, it's done. Okay, on to the next thing versus being entrusted to lead something that, has been running for 60 years. And what does it look like to have it set up to run for another 60 years? When I will definitely not be here to reap any benefit from it whatsoever, or even get any acknowledgement for
Hmm.
that. So I just think that we should appreciate that we need all those organizations in our society for it to be functional. And as a result, we need archetypes of leadership in each of those. And they're similar in some ways, but there are a lot of differences. The leader that's thinking about running that Mari organization, iwi led organization, which is what they will call it, they're thinking about a very different story. They're thinking about their great grandkids, and that's fine. And the other organization that's the private business startup, they're not.
What I really like about this is it gives people another option. And, going into a leadership role, I think it's helpful for us to be thoughtful about what kind of leader do we want to be? And are we in this stewardship type role? Or are we in the trailblazing short term role? And just being thoughtful about that is important. Any final things you'd like to say as we wrap up here, Ian?
I think it's a privilege for a person to have the opportunities to engage in all those leadership challenges. I think each of us would have a particular perspective around our values as to which one fits the way we want to contribute to our society. And I also should say, no matter what task you pick, frame it as an opportunity to contribute. So, you're going to extract some value out of it. Like they pay me to do this job.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's good. But, try to think about how what you're doing is actually also contributing to others. Would be a good principle around leadership. It tends to mean that means it's actually a repeat cycle game. Like it's not just a one-off, which means you get more opportunities going forward. So that's kind of been my story.
Well, Ian, again, this is so interesting. I love I'm grateful for the chance that we had to go a little deeper on this idea of stewardship. You've given me a lot to think about and given me a totally different perspective on leadership. And I've been teaching leadership for a long time. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast today, Ian.
It's my pleasure, Nate. Thank you for having me. And I am honored to contribute to the wealth of expertise that you've developed in doing this.